right, thanks very much, Paul. Can everybody hear me? Excellent. So for those that got in at 3:30 in the morning, congratulations, you're 12 hours into the next day, so good for you, keep going. So I'm going to be talking about the white sea bass here. You've already heard from our group talks on California halibut and California yellowtail. This is a species we've actually been working on longer. I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors, Mike Shane, Eric McIntyre, and Connie Silbernagel. Mike and Connie are both here. Eric's back taking care of fish. So this is the species I'm going to be talking about. It's not really a sea bass or certainly a white bass, so there is some confusion about it when we talk about it. It's actually a cyanid. It's a croaker. It's a regional species, so you may not be familiar with it as well. As I'll show you, it's found up and down the West Coast. It's an extremely popular sport fish, and also there's a commercial fishery for it. So you can see this is a recreational fisherman here. We've been working on this primarily for stock replenishment since the early 80s. So it's got a long, long history right up there with red drum and some others. So again, a lot of this talk is going to be geared towards the stock replenishment foundation that we've been working from. But I will talk about a few pilot projects that we've been involved with trying to explore the potential commercial feasibility for this species. So just to give you a quick overview of the biology of this fish, so if you look over here, again, you've got the west coast of the US going down into Baja. The fish ranges all the way up here. Most of the fish are centered here, but again, as the water warms, they'll move north. You can see, it's probably hard to see here, but the dots that are represented here, these are ichthyoplankton surveys that are actually done up and down the coast. And the point here would be that most of the spawning, at least when this was done, and this is a 1983 publication, so the time series is some years ago, but this would suggest that most of the spawning occurs down in this area, Southern California, kind of in the northern part. So that's an important consideration relative to where you're going to culture the fish and how you're going to culture them. Because some people think, oh, why don't you just culture them up here? Well, the eggs and larvae aren't found there, so it's really challenging depending on how you're going to do it. Just a little bit more about the life history then. It's a coastal pelagic, so it moves around a lot. Again, the way this map is scaled, there's some coastal islands out here. We're right here in San Diego. We have a hatchery in Carlsbad about half hour up the coast from there. So we operate out of 2 different laboratories. What else to say about that? So again, the adults move around in this area. They tend to inhabit rocky reefs and kelp bed areas. They spawn offshore, so the eggs are pelagic and found offshore, so that's another important consideration. They're not found in bays and estuaries where you're going to have temperature and salinity fluctuations, so you really need to adapt your culture environment to that. Juveniles will be found in bays and estuaries, so they are pretty eurythermal and euryhaline. In terms of natural production, they mature at 3 to 4 years. Again, spawning is in the spring to summer. They're batch spawners, so they spawn multiple times during a season. It's a pelagic egg, on average about 1.2 plus millimeters in diameter. We've learned quite a bit about hatchery spawning. And again, some of this comes out of this publication. If you're interested in this, we did some genetic parentage analysis and found that individual females will produce up to 10 batches per season. And again, depending on the female, spawn every 1 to 5 weeks. This was pretty incredible. A single female in a single batch producing almost 6 million eggs, so pretty highly fecund there. In terms of that fecundity per unit weight, it's about, in this particular case, 360,000 eggs per kilo. So I think the typical average would be more like 100,000 eggs per kilo. But again, it's pretty impressive, and it was pretty incredible to be able to uncover that through the genetic analysis. So in terms of age and growth, they live 20 to 30 years. This is the maximum size. So it's the largest cyanid on the West Coast. This guy caught the world record, so he should be pretty proud of that. If you look at the maximum size, and again, this is the world record, you can kind of get an idea how tall he is. But anyway, and we aged that fish, I think it was, what, 24 years old or something like that? Higher? 27. Okay, just going to go through kind of the culture process that we use, and again, some of this is adapted to our particular situation, but collecting fish, more often than not, we work with sport fishermen. We have some cages out at Catalina Island, which is about 22 miles off the coast of Los Angeles, that the fish are really patchy in their distribution in time and space, so a lot of times you go out fishing for them and you come up empty. But if you do it enough, we can stockpile fish out in these cages and acclimate them to feeds and so forth. get enough fish to bring them all back to the mainland. We have a 45-day quarantine period, and then we stock them into our main breeding pools that are about 40 tons or so. In terms of feeds and feeding, it's pretty straightforward. Right now we're feeding fresh fish and squid with this species. With another species we're working, trying to develop a formulated feed, but we're not quite there yet with these guys. And this works well enough. We get super high quality eggs, so it's all good. We feed these 5 times per week. We supplement that with vitamins, a vitamin premix 3 times a week, and just below satiation. This shows you, again, spawning profiles. So in terms of commercial viability, egg production for this fish is no problem. So these are 4 different spawning tanks within a calendar year, and these numbers are a little bit dated, but it just shows you what the potential is. So we use photothermal manipulation. So this is temperature increasing, day length increasing, within a pretty narrow range, 13 to 14 degrees centigrade on the wintering end of things where you don't want spawning, and you can kick them up to 17 or 18. These spikes all represent spawning events. Egg production here is in thousands of eggs, so I can't, that's 1 million eggs right there. So you can see you get quite a bit of production. So again, these are 4 different tanks within the same calendar year. If you overlap these, you got tons of eggs all the time. I think in this particular time series, we were probably getting about 1 billion eggs a year. A point to make about that is we only use a small fraction of those for the work we do. So in terms of commercial development, those eggs could be available. Again, they're from wild-caught broodstock because genetic diversity is a big deal for us in our replenishment program, but still I think it's something to work with. Larval rearing, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here other than just point out some highlights. It's a species that you can pretty much use standard rearing protocols for. In fact, it's actually easier than that. You don't really need rotifers. You don't need green water. So if you look down here, we can go right onto Artemia straight away. The other thing, so again, you can manipulate this. There's 100 different recipes probably you could use to be successful. The microbial control we found to be important with all our species, so that's something that's just critical to this success here. And again, as far as commercialization, this is a component to it. We're getting consistent survival, 20 to 40%, as high as 60% from an egg to a 50-day-old fully metamorphosed juvenile. So, you know, still some variability in here, but 20% is good enough, and we can probably get this up again. Probably a fair amount of that is due to working with wild broodstock. Nursery, again, nothing too crazy here. We between the larval area and the nursery area, the key for us is it's all ultimately working in RAS units, keeping a pretty stable temperature. Again, as the fish get bigger, you got opportunity to go a little bit lower, a little bit higher with this. Moderate densities. Again, key for us is sterilizing the makeup water to these units so that you can maintain good biosecurity. And within the hatchery itself, in these early life stages, we have very few disease issues, which is awesome. In terms of feed right now, we're using this diet. It's 47-12 protein to lipid. That's higher than we actually need to be using. So if you were trying to do this commercially, there's room to play there. The species we've determined can actually work with like a 42-10 diet. In terms of growout, again, most of the work that we do is geared towards an endpoint of releasing the animals at about 20 centimeters. I've done a lot of work, you know, growing them in raceways, small-scale cages. So the way our replenishment program works is we've had as many as 13 different volunteer-run growout facilities. These are small cages that volunteers can run, and they receive from us like a 3-inch fish. They'll grow them to 8 or 10 and then release them in those areas. So again, it's an interesting, when you start to talk about some of the health problems that we've had and so forth, you have these cages sited in all different areas. It's almost like a bioassay test in some regards, but this is something that we manage. And then again, I'm going to focus for the purposes of this talk. Obviously, the interest is on commercial feasibility, so on a couple commercial trials that we've done. So, and some of this is dated, so it's like, it's a flashback in time. This work was funded back in the late 90s by a Salt and Stall Kennedy grant. So we installed some basically salmon cages off Catalina Island, tucked in here. You can see them right in here. So it's pretty well protected on 3 sides. They're 4 10-meter by 10-meter square cages. We did a 2-year study down there. You can see some of the fish here. The whole idea was instead of releasing the fish at 8 or 10 inches, grow them to a larger size, get them out there in the market, see what people think about them. So we did that. It was a really successful project, you know, trying to do all of this, permit this, put it in place, do almost a 2-year grow out, and a 2-year project with $200,000 was quite a feat. I don't know that we could do that these days, but these cages are still out there and we still use them for broodstock collecting in our replenishment program. Some of the output just in terms of growth, to give you an idea of what we're looking at here, again, nothing like we heard on the cobia front. This is the cage results here. So again, depending on what water temperatures were out at Catalina Island, you can see kind of variable growth here. These are some fish we held longer in a raceway. So again, with bay water, warmer temperature, it just kind of shows you what's possible here if you're working in a RAS or if you're at a different location. So a market size for this fish, as I'll say later in the talk, hasn't really been determined yet, but obviously you're going to be challenged depending on what you're trying to rear them in to get, you know, a 2-kilo fish or something of that size. And again, this is 20 years ago, so I would guess that with improvements in nutrition and some of the hatchery techniques that this could be improved. And the water temperatures are a couple degrees warmer too, so water temperatures at Catalina during this study were about 12 to 22 degrees centigrade. So then another study that we did in partnership with Pacifico Aquaculture, which is just down the road across the border in Baja, was providing them some fish. So this is actually not researchers doing it, but some real real commercial guys doing it. And here's some of the output they provided us relative to the performance of some of those cohorts. So you can, again, you can see the temperature range here a bit narrower than we saw at Catalina. FCRs that they reported, and so on and so forth. And again, they took these to market, and this is kind of the value that they saw. So anyway, it was a good trial. We got some good information from a working farm. That was about 8 years ago. In terms of disease and prevention, here's a laundry list of things that we've seen. You know, these are probably some of the more common things that we see, but even those are not really that common. So for the most part, if you've got the fish, certainly in the protected RAS units, you have that protection, so that's great. You know, you got to produce a high quality fish and put them in a good rearing environment to avoid some of this stuff. We have seen, as George alluded to, VNNV some years ago. It affected larval fish. We get near complete mortality. Again, working with some colleagues from Japan, they've published kill rates for UV and ozone, so we were able to install that in our larval rearing systems, and we haven't seen that in 15 years or so. So that's kind of a nice success story. Herpes type virus, that's something that's popped up here and again. Again, I don't think we've seen it in 10 years or more. So gas bubble disease, this fish is super sensitive. I forget who else said, I think George did with the cod. You know, 101, 102%, you're going to have issues with this fish, so that's something we have to mitigate in the hatchery setting. There's only a couple treatments that we have available to try and combat this stuff. So, in terms of market considerations then, as I mentioned previously, the market for these fish it's undefined. We've done some test marketing, so we have some insights into that. The Pacifico group did some as well. So it looks promising, but for the most part, you know, right now what's on the markets for this particular species is a wild fish. It's seasonally available. It's not that large. There's a 28-inch minimum size, so it's like a 2-3 kilo fish. So again, the farm product would be a whole different market category, very likely. Again, we've talked to some distributors and so forth, and there may be some niche market areas for this thing to explore, but that needs to be determined. In terms of areas of research, I think, again, the first thing that would need to be done is probably really solidify that there is a market for it before you're going to get too deep into anything like selective breeding. But then, you know, some of the things that have mentioned over and over again in terms of nutrition, we've done a lot of research on sustainable feed development. We've got a number of experimental feeds that can work or have been demonstrated to work on an experimental level, but would need to be obviously produced on a mass quantity and determine, see if it's economically viable to produce those diets. But again, a lot of research, and then obviously more research, as I think Dan mentioned, or someone else mentioned, or we'd all mentioned, as you produce more and more fish, this is going to be more and more of an issue. So it'd be nice to get out in front of that. And with that, I would say thank you. There's so many people that I would have to thank that I couldn't list them all. I mean, it's just been 30 years in the making, so if you've been part of this, thank you.